Okay, I'm Steve Threadgold, the digital editor of Journal of Youth Studies, and I'm here with Janice McLaughlin, who is the this year's winner of the Andy Furlong Prize for the best paper in the journal. So congratulations, Janice.
Thanks very much, Steve. Really appreciate it. It's a you know honor to me to kind of have that kind of recognition for the paper and to be linked to Andy's name and work as well.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so the paper is named after Andy Furlong, the founding editor of the journal. So yeah, I suppose we're going to just kind of have a chat about your paper and the work. So can you maybe start off with by telling me a little bit about your connection to youth studies?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I've been working with ideas from youth studies for a long time. My work is around disability and childhood and adolescence and transitions into adulthood. So, obviously, youth studies is a resource for thinking through that. So I've been familiar with youth studies work for a long time, but in more recent years, we've been particularly focusing in on thinking about transitions for disabled young people from adolescence into adulthood, and trying to sort of think about ways in which we can not just sort of bring disability into youth studies, thinking about transitions, but also kind of create more dialogue between these different disciplinary areas, thinking about disability, thinking about, being a young person in the world right now, and trying to kind of bring that dialogue into a kind of more kind of constructive conversation.
Okay. And so you've been working with some of the youth studies kind of work for a little while. What has that been so far? What's some of the work you've
Um,
been influenced by or brought into your own work?
yeah, I mean, obviously, crucially, the work that Rob McDonald and Tracy Shildrick have done also that links in with Andy
Yep.
Furlong's work of thinking about how we can sort of study young people's lives, acknowledging issues around identity, issues around kind of culture, but really locating that in its socioeconomic contexts and conditions, and understanding how some of the shifts that have happened in the broader kind of economies of, Western Europe, the global North, are sort of changing young people's lives, but trying to put that into a context that's understanding that over time. But then going back, if we think about disability, how might that change that understanding of ways in which transitions have shifted in the context of socioeconomic change?
Yep. Okay. Okay, so can you tell me a little bit about paper? What was the motivation for it? What's the intervention you're trying to make and summarize a little bit.
Sure. So we were actually, myself and colleagues at Glasgow University, as well as Tracy Shildrick as well, were working on a proposal for funding to explore sort of transitions for disabled young people in sort of Scotland and in the northeast of England, understanding these transitions within kind of contemporary contexts. So as part of working up that proposal, we were thinking through some of these different ideas. So it was kind of at the forefront of my mind of kind of, well, there is all this work happening in disability studies, particularly critical disability studies,
Yep.
that is really important and could be brought into conversation with youth studies, and what would that look like? Because I think what we've seen in youth studies is not that disability has been completely ignored, but that it tends to be that here are specific papers looking at disability.
Yep.
Um, and that's replicated in other areas as well, where disability is at the end of a kind of long list of intersectional inequalities. But it's saying, well, let's take another step and think not just about disability, but think about kind of how the ideas within disability studies, particularly critical disability studies, could enhance our understandings of not just disabled young people's lives, but the lives of other kind of particularly marginalized young people in these kind of quite trying times that we have been in for quite a long time now, around welfare austerity, around kind of changes in economies, and multiple factors that are making young people's lives tricky.
Yep.
And I think disability studies has something to add to our understandings of what's making that tricky, what's making that elongated, and how inequalities feed into who's having a better time, who's having a worse time within all of this.
Yeah. Okay. So can you tell me about the kind of um, definition of disability that you use in the paper? Because there's a number of them in the kind of social sciences, isn't there?
That's right. And it's a it's an exciting area to be working in, and an area that's shifting and changing. So at its base, we're still working with what kind of is generally referred to as the social model of disability,
Mhm.
which is saying that there are, embodied differences that people can experience that are linked to impairment. But there are also these societal barriers, economic barriers, structures which are disabling, so that there can be differences in how people's bodies engage with the world, and their minds too.
Mhm.
But what creates the disability is what happens after. So that still it sits at a basis of our understanding of disability. But there is also a very live debate within disability studies about needing to kind of complicate that understanding a little bit and acknowledge, because what has happened a little bit within that social model understanding is a kind of parking of impairment and illness as less of a focus because it's about these structural and social barriers. But more contemporary work is trying to think about how do people live with embodied differences? How do they explore and experience dynamics such as pain? um, in the context of societal barriers. So it's trying to kind of fold those worlds together. And I think there's an echo there within, I think, critical use studies, which is saying structural barriers are really important, but we also need to understand how people navigate their lives through those structural barriers. How do we engage with notions of relational agency within these processes? So I think that's why there is that overlap, I think, in what people are trying to do.
Yeah, yeah. And so one of the kind of motivations of the paper is just to kind of bring some of those kind of empirical and conceptual ideas from critical disability studies to help understand the kind of blurry, fractured, elongated youth transitions that
Mm,
youth studies has been looking at for since the journal began, right?
absolutely. And I think the sort of ways about kind of I think one of the things that disability kind of perhaps troubles a little bit, which I think is what critical use studies and the journal is also trying to say, is it's not trying to present a version of the world which goes in the 60s in the post-war settlement, everything was lovely, and there was this pathways that young people had.
Mm.
And then 70s onwards, it tips into this chaos, and then things get elongated and things get more difficult. We know that class makes that story more complicated. And disability certainly makes that story more complicated because it wasn't that disabled young people were making this nice transition from education into, secure employment. And that instead kind of, and also that the sort of notion of the protective welfare state
Yep.
was actually more a problematic welfare state for disability in terms of thinking about ways in which kind of disabled people were not getting access to support, but also ways in which their lives were being defined and excluded through the ways kind of welfare state operations were kind of playing out. So at the same time as we're sort of getting this notion that the welfare state was providing this underlying structure for young people's transitions into adulthood, we had a disability movement in different parts of the global north saying the welfare state is a problem for disabled people. So bringing disability in helps that sort of work that critical
Yep.
youth studies is doing to sort of question how do we tell that story of social change over time since the kind of post-war era. It's not kind of as straightforward as everything was good and then everything was bad.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. And I think, yeah, there's been some work by Andy Furlong and Rob McDonald over the years that has kind of made those points as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So in the paper, you're just kind of speaking about the welfare state there, and you also there's kind of three key institutions you see as
Mm.
being, I suppose, empirical areas where this kind of combination would be particularly fruitful: the welfare state, higher education, and the family.
Yeah.
So, can you tell us a little bit about what it means, what you would like to say about this for higher education, for instance?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, we are seeing disabled young people moving into higher education in higher numbers. But it's being nuanced about thinking about, well, what does that mean? So for example, people with learning disabilities are not moving into higher education in
Mhm.
the same kind of numbers. So we need to kind of get to that granular level that people recognize as important within youth studies of kind of who's getting the benefit of higher education.
Yep.
And then when we look at the other side of higher education, who gets the benefit in terms of that link then into career possibilities and employment. And it's a really messy picture. And in the work that we're doing now within the project where we are looking at disability and youth transitions, there's lots of issues around those shifts from secondary education into further education colleges, into universities, where lots of things happen that get in the way of disabled young people kind of making it through those pathways, and also that sense that's part of that wider debate around the education to employment kind of link of this rhetoric around if you have the right aspirations and you take the right steps and you do the right thing, you're going to end up in a better place. um, again, bring disability and class together and race, and you just say that's not what's happening. And particularly in the UK at the moment, where there's a lot of focus on we need to get young people into employment, understanding that it's not just about that aspiration for higher education that's going to get you there is actually a really important intervention to make, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I've written sometimes about like the kind of myth of meritocracy kind of thing, and definitely the critical disabilities perspective fundamentally challenges those ideas, doesn't it? It kind of the very notion of meritocracy almost kind of brackets out anyone with a that without with a kind of disability in its very conceptual basis, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And it's also that kind of its foundation in individualism, which kind of
Yeah.
excludes kind of possibilities of ways in which, well, excludes the realities that kind of underneath that meritocracy is a whole lot of people that are helping that individual make their way through the world. And
Mm.
crucially, the arguments about intergenerational wealth and capital are really fundamental to that. And again, when we bring disability into our analysis of that, one of the things that it shows us is that for quite a lot, not all, but again, for quite a lot of disabled young people, that intergenerational wealth is spent before they get into possibilities of higher education because their family are already subsidizing
Yep.
what they're not getting from the welfare state. So there's a whole set of dynamics that sort of focusing on what individual aspiration or what meritocracy gets you
Yep.
just doesn't engage with.
Yep. Yep. That's great. Okay. And so, yeah, you talked a little bit about the welfare state and a little bit of higher education. And so the family, as you've kind of gestured towards there, is another important institution that, from various sociological perspectives can kind of buttress people from risks or provide opportunities and that kind of thing. So can you talk a little bit more about what this perspective brings to an understanding of the family?
Yeah, and it's really important within disability work on disabled young people's lives that, yeah, family is a huge important kind of resource in disabled young people's lives. It is providing a lot of the care that the state doesn't.
Yeah.
But that also then generates kind of, a sense of, one of the things we've been doing work on disability and family for, over 20 years now. And then the narrative that families talk about is the fight that you have to fight for the provision for your child or your young person, and as they move into adulthood. And that has not changed in any way in over 20 years. And I would say it goes further back than that. And there are inequalities in that of who gets to fight, who's able to fight, and how all these different changes we're seeing to welfare structures have not changed that significance of what family means. And it's important to value and recognize family within this and what they're providing, but of thinking about what the limitations and inequalities to that are.
Yeah.
And then there's also dynamics about thinking about, well, what we see or what adulthood is presented as is that kind of independence, that step away from family. Now, that's a kind of fictional notion for any young person. But that kind of norm that that's what adulthood is about creates a kind of, again, social judgments and norms around disabled young people, around things such as should the priority be leaving home? Should the priority be independence? And how might we complicate that account to think about different ways in which people live family lives? And again, that enhances not just our understanding of disability, but our understanding of how lots of people are living familiar lives that aren't that kind of nuclear embedded model
Yep.
that kind of focuses in on those steps.
Yep. Okay. Great. Towards the end of the paper, you start talking about two, I suppose, things that have been important to youth studies as well. Notions of like embodiment, and like the notion of normal and normate there. And the other one I was really interested in because I've written a little bit about this myself is kind of time, but like the way that kind of relates to concepts of adulthood. So yeah,
Mm.
could you tell us a little bit more about those things?
Yeah, and I think embodiment and time are really closely related, and I'm just trying to work through some arguments about that in a paper just now. One of the things we've written about elsewhere as well is the notion that in a context of particularly physical impairments, that time and embodiment can be experienced differently as you're moving into adulthood. So sometimes people talk about a kind of notion of kind of enhanced aging, that you're experiencing that move into adulthood. All young people's bodies as you're changing as you're becoming an adult.
Hmm.
But if that's in the context of also impairment, and you're thinking about questions, for example, about mobility, and how, again, you're thinking about, well, in order for me to be able to work in a context of disability and disablement within society, I need to stay as mobile as I possibly can. And that then leads into a cycle of intervention upon the body to try to kind of match these ideals, these norms about what the productive worker looks like.
Yep.
So time is shifted in that dynamic, but also wanting to keep hold of ideas about how young people might be resistant to those norms, might kind of want to spend time in different ways, want to kind of engage with sort of relational time and
Mm.
relational embodiment. And one aspect of that that we're trying to think through at the moment is around care, which is a kind of, again, a very contested concept within disability studies. And I'll leave it there because that will take me forever to unpack.
Yep.
But thinking of spending time around care, and around relational embodiments with others through caring dynamics is something which potentially kind of says, I'm not just going to be about being this mobile individual productive worker. I might be somebody else
Yep.
in connection and relationship to others, and that reflects also then how I spend my time. So there's lots to unpack there, but I think
Yeah.
something really interesting to think through.
Yep. Yeah. I really like the line. There's a line in the paper. I'm not sure I'll get 100% right, but it's like something about the safety of being with others.
Mm,
Right
mm.
about. Yeah. I think that's a really interesting way to think about the relation
Yeah.
that you're talking about specifically, but also like a broader understanding of how we live. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I've been doing some work with a new colleague to me at Newcastle, where we've been looking at the sort of dynamics of safety within community, partly because, again, in some of the work I've been doing around disability, safety is a concept that comes up a lot of needing to feel safe. And in what some ways, I think that's wanting to problematize that more a little bit of what does it say for wider society that your goal is safety.
Hmm.
'Cause safety is a kind of almost can feel like a minimalist kind of
Yeah.
status that one can have, that
Yep.
I'm not at risk here because I'm safe. So what would a community look like that was thriving, that was, again, can be a problematic term, but nurturing?
Mm.
What is a safety? What is a community that enables you to take risks,
Yep.
but to feel, protected within taking risks? So I think safety in connection to others is a really important kind of value, but I'm also starting to think about how do we get go even further than that because safety is important, but surely we should also be creating spaces that go beyond that,
Yeah,
that enable people to explore and experiment and be valued in that.
yeah, to flourish. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, I think that's a pretty good note to finish on. I think I'll just quickly put you on the spot. If someone's interested in this area, what other work do you think they should maybe be having a look at?
Oh, that's a really good question. So within disability studies, I mean, it doesn't need referencing because everybody knows him, but Dan Goodley's work is very important. Margaret Sheldrake as well, but I think there's some really interesting newer authors coming along. Actually, we did. I'll put a call out for. We did a special issue in Sociology of Health and Illness, bringing medical sociology and disability studies together. And there's some really interesting work from some established authors, but some newer authors, and also from different international contexts. And some of those themes are looking at embodiment and disability, identity, time. So that's really good. And then there's so much work within your journal that is just really important to flag and to engage with. So there's plenty of work out there for people to look at.
Excellent. Okay, Janice. So thanks so much for your time, and again, congratulations on winning this year's Andy Furlong Award. Um, and yeah, hope to see more of your work in the journal.
Okay. Thanks, Stephen, and thanks very much for your time today as well.
Thank you.